After the very strong start to the War Within, we're now deep enough into the new season that we can continue to try to get a better handle if that initially positive response was just the glow of having a bunch of new content or something more that will be carried through to the rest of the expansion. A couple of weeks ago, I did a dive into the current state of Delves, which turned out to have some quite mixed results. And this week, it's the turn of what is probably one of the most important parts of the modern World of Warcraft season. Yes, it's time to dive into Mythic Plus. For the War Within, Mythic Plus has undergone some pretty massive changes. In Season 4 of Dragonflight, we saw a key level squish with the effective removal of the previous +2 to +9 key levels, with Mythic 0 being increased in difficulty to the old +10 and a +2 key now matching a +12 under the old system. Blizzard explained at the time that they wanted to make both Heroic Dungeons and Mythic 0 dungeons more relevant outside of the initial expansion pre-season, along with a desire to give players who did not like the Mythic Plus timer a harder option to progress. For the War Within, the substantial changes have continued with the introduction of a complete revamp to the affix system, with a brand new Kiss Curse affix rotation, the introduction of a new Challenger's Peril affix, which increases the punishment for death, and the effective removal of affixes for higher keys, phasing in from +10 to +12, but being offset by notably increased difficulty. And the changes haven't stopped there, with some significant changes to loot rewards, with the all-important Myth Track gear now requiring that we do a +10 instead of a +8, and Gilded Crest dropping from at least initially a +9 instead of a +6. And finally came a significant change to pacing, with Mythic 0, the old staple of the start of season gearing, not opening up until the season launched, and Mythic Plus being held back until week 2 of the season. But by far the oddest change was to Mythic 0. Previously dropping champion gear, it now drops veteran gear from the bosses and champion gear from the vault, with veteran and even champion gear being farmable from delves and open world content. The initial reaction to this was from a lot of the player base to ask if it was a typo. But no, it wasn't, the end result being that Mythic 0 is back to feeling pretty irrelevant as seasonal content, and with it being unavailable in the pre-season, in my opinion, it's been kinda pointless overall. And of course, Heroic Dungeons are now where Mythic 0 used to be. That is, they're only really relevant for the pre-season. Given Blizzard's stated goals to make Heroic and Mythic Plus more relevant, this was a frankly bizarre change, which only makes sense in my opinion on a spreadsheet when you're trying to fit loot to the Mythic Plus gearing curve, which at all levels offers poorer gear than we had become used to. Once we actually had a chance to get into doing the content, part of the reason for this change became clear, with Heroic Dungeons turning out to be significantly easier than was expected. Building Season 4 changes and be increased to match the old Mythic 0 difficulty, this is clearly not the case in the War Within, with the difficulty as experienced by the players being much closer to the original pre-Season 4 difficulty. And this trend continued with Mythic 0, which at the time created a very strong impression that the difficulty curve had been dropped significantly, which could explain why the Myth Track gear had been pushed out to a +10. As I already mentioned, Delves offer significantly better gear, albeit for a slightly harder challenge. But following some very heavy nerfs in week 1 of the season, that challenge has also been watered down, and our prediction as a community that Mythic 0 would end up being irrelevant has turned out to be accurate. In fact, the only point to do a Mythic 0 dungeon was to be able to see the layout of the dungeons before going into Mythic Plus. Any expectation though that Mythic Plus might perhaps also be going to be easier was quickly dispelled. While the lowest 2 and 3 keys do not feel very challenging, moving beyond that and things quickly change. For most players, even the lower keys from +4 onwards feel noticeably harder than usual, and it's only been ramping up from there. It was very quickly becoming clear that that expectation of possibly an easier season was very much unfounded. It didn't take long from there for the cracks to begin to show, with a major backlash against the season developing across social media and the forums, as players found that their goals, be it to get KSM or to farm myth track gear were being thwarted by a clearly much harder difficulty curve. Gaming is of course all about the feels, and a widespread feeling that this wasn't fun led players to struggle to articulate exactly what was going wrong, with very widespread complaints about increased toxicity, gatekeeping, and of course the new affixes. Theories that delves were leading people to get more gear and crashing into a Mythic Plus level they didn't usually manage to reach, or just an influx of new toxic players abounded. But in my view, none of these theories are particularly well founded. So what exactly went wrong to generate such a response? The toxicity, of course, is the easiest to explain. Research carried out by other gaming companies has found that while toxic trolls do indeed exist, most expressions of toxicity in gaming are one-off events stemming from player frustration at their own gameplay, or just as often the game itself. Whenever players encounter a wall, be it in progress or in trying to achieve a goal that they expect to be able to achieve, some are going to lash out. And encountering a season that is much harder to progress than what we are used to, well, with hindsight, the result was kinda predictable. The other main explanation, the affixes, is where things do get a bit more nuanced. The new +2 Kiss Curse affix rotation is, in my opinion, a major improvement from the past. I mean, there are no way these new affixes come even close to how miserable a Sanguine or a Grievous was, but that doesn't let the new system off the hook entirely. One focus of complaint is Challenger's Peril, the new affix introduced at a +7, which increases the penalty for deaths in a run from 5 seconds to 15 seconds. As it happens, this coincides with what feels like a major difficulty jump. Blizzard added this affix to encourage a more strategic and less risk-taking approach to keys, but in my opinion, the affix has largely failed in that goal. In terms of the player experience, the affix has turned out to add nothing positive to the game. Instead, it exacerbates a Mythic Plus culture of quitting possibly viable keys after a couple of deaths, along with even more frustration and annoyance. One of the common complaints from the old affixes was that they detracted, not added to the experience, and this is definitely still the case for Challenger's Peril. And for players in organised group at higher levels, the removal of the affix rotation and a new flat difficulty increase also proved to be very unpopular. At +12, there is now a massive jump in difficulty, where it's possible for a team to +2 an 11 key only to get a 13 key that it's impossible for the same group to complete. But affixes are not the whole story, of course. It's fairly clear that the difficulty goalposts for Mythic Plus have been moved substantially upwards. While a +2 key is still around the same difficulty as we were used to in pre-Season 4 levels, even from as low as a +6 or +7, the difficulty feels significantly higher than the Season 4 equivalent, and that only ramps up the higher you go. The end result of moving the bottom levels of the keys down a bit in difficulty, but the middle and the top up, has been to create a feeling of stretching out the Mythic Plus progression curve substantially, widening the gap between keys. Add in the new affix design, which creates very large step changes at +7, +10 and +12. In my view, players are encountering a very uneven progression curve, with some very significant walls. Now, I am aware that scaling between keys has not, at least on paper, changed, but in practice, the day-to-day experience of Mythic Plus players is that the steps between the key levels feel much bigger. In my opinion, a big part of what players enjoyed about the previous Mythic Plus system was that it offered a significant challenge for players of all levels, but in a way where overcoming those challenges opened up more opportunities to progress, along with a satisfying medium and longer term reward progression. A big part of that feeling came from the lack of major walls, until you progressed into the very extreme high levels of Mythic Plus, which were far beyond the point of where the rewards capped out. Encountering a major progress wall with no obvious way, be it through gear or more practice, to get past it is super discouraging. So no wonder there was a backlash, with plenty of talk of folks quitting Mythic Plus or even the game itself. In my opinion, the Blizzard devs seem to have tried to close the perceived difficulty gap between Mythic Raiding and Mythic Plus for equivalent rewards. The problem with this is that Mythic raiding has become fairly inaccessible for a sizable chunk of the mainstream player base, partly because of the organisational challenge of a fixed 20-man roster, but also the massive mechanical difficulty gap between heroic and mythic raiding that, in my opinion, has been driven by the developers chasing the race to world first player base. The problem with trying to close the gap by moving Mythic Plus closer to the mythic raid without addressing the issues that put so many players off mythic raiding merely brings those problems into Mythic Plus with pretty much the same results as has happened for the raid. If you have a system that is popular and another system that is not, trying to solve that by copying the unpopular thing just ends up creating a race to the bottom. And it's not the first time we have been here. Back when Cataclysm was launched, Blizzard increased the difficulty of heroic dungeons, widening the gap between them and normal, but without offering any alternative to fill that gap. This was at the time hugely unpopular, and at the time people did call it out as one of the reasons that Cataclysm was seen as a bad expansion, and one that marked the beginning of the decline in player numbers from their then peak of 12 million. And sadly, that's a lesson that seems to have been forgotten by the developers over time. For example, there was a requirement for silver proving grounds and warlords, and now today we see this sudden jump in Mythic Plus difficulty. Now, I do want to be clear, the issue here isn't that there's harder content. We all do like a challenge, but at the same time, we do not like having a major part of the game we enjoy be feeling like it's ripped away from us. In this case, the ability for many of the players to get the bestish gear in the game in a reasonable time frame without needing to treat the game as a full-time job. So where do we go from here? Blizzard have already responded to player feedback with a reduction in the severity of the plus 12 affix, some boosts to the KISS part of the plus 2 affixes, and we can now also get Gilded Crest from a plus 8. And just last week, they followed up with a major change to the most disliked part of the new affix set, Challenger's Peril. This affix, which increases the time penalty for a player death from 5 seconds to 15, is now being offset with an increase of 90 seconds to the timer. This effectively means that you get 9 extra lives before the impact to the timer starts to exceed what it used to be. And it also gives a bit of a KISS element where the timer effectively gets extended if you have fewer deaths than those 9. Now, these changes are proving to be somewhat successful in reducing the negative feedback and the impact of the player backlash. To what extent, however, this will hold up for the remainder of the season does remain to be seen. But for me, this is mainly a short-term sticking plaster fix to reduce player burnout and attrition and avoid the need for some more major mid-season changes that would likely destabilize progression in a way that was similar to the introduction of Augmentation Evoker back in Dragonflight Season 1. What this means is that I do still think that Mythic Plus needs some more attention, both in terms of some longer term fixes, but also a more medium term fix to carry it into the next season. For the longer term, Blizzard do need to learn those lessons from the past and embed them into their design thinking. Yes, the race to world first is great and brings in a lot of marketing opportunities, but it serves at most 50 to 100 players. And while Mythic raiding is an aspirational goal for many, many more, aspirations have to be reachable, otherwise the end result is disengaging and player burnout. The issue of the ever-growing gap between the Mythic raid and Heroic does need to be addressed. We cannot continue with the Mythic raid getting ever and ever harder, at least if we want raiding to survive and have enough players to justify the development cost of catering to the race to world first. Another major long-term fix is to address the lack of tanks and healers. Currently, there is a significant imbalance in tank and healer numbers versus DPS numbers. It is this imbalance more than anything else that makes it so very, very difficult for many DPS players to get invited to group. Anytime I set up a key in Group Finder which has both a healer and a tank already, I get a few dozen applications from DPS. Sure, some of those folks I disqualify either through gear or through low score, but you can still easily end up with 20 perfectly viable players still chasing a single slot. And as somebody who isn't picky about comp or class, that means that I'm still nevertheless going to be letting down 19 or more players. Now, I cannot speak for healers, but I can speak for tanking, and part of the issue is actually community based. Tanks are expected to lead, especially but not only in pug groups, and as a tank it can often feel like you're solely responsible for the key's success or failure. Not to mention the fact that you get blamed if your DPS body pulls in some bonus packs and causes you to go over the ad percentage. But on Blizzard's side, I personally feel that the developers are very disconnected from what the tank community wants from the game. Attempts to force us to make smaller pools such as Challenger's Peril, instead of reducing the pressure for newer tanks, just makes it much harder for them. In my view, for the longer term, in order to make tanking more attractive, allowing tanks to do more damage and to be more self-sufficient is the way to go. The healers I know would much rather focus on looking after the DPS along with the odd tank dispel. And as a tank, doing damage is an important part of a toolkit, and it's one of the few non-binary opportunities to measure our progress as players. Another change I would like to see is a way to reward DPS more for doing utility stuff like stops and interrupt. How about giving DPS a 5% damage buff for every successful interrupt they do? I can guarantee you that you would overnight quadruple the amount of interrupts that DPS players do. For the medium term, the next season is going to need some very major adjustments. The progression curve for Mythic Plus, in my opinion, needs to be reduced. The good news is that we do have an example of what a good progression curve looks like. Dragonflight Season 3 was the best Mythic Plus season ever, with participation rates achieving an all-time high for a mid to late expansion season, and in fact it managed to outstrip even the end participation of some first seasons. Now, this does not mean that we have to go back to the pre-key squish. While Season 4 did not reach the heights of Season 3, it got surprisingly close, especially at a time when it was having to compete with things like Remix, or indeed the lack of other new content in the game. On the affix front, the new rotation is an improvement, and it does need some more time for us to get a full handle on its success, but the +7 affix Challenger's Feral does need to go. While Blizzard have explained their goal is to encourage more precise play and increase the risks in player decisions, this really seems to be a lot more about what the developers want rather than giving a good experience to players. What the affix does instead is to make higher level play more risk averse, which is ultimately less interesting and enjoyable. And at the same time for pugs, it does encourage, as I mentioned earlier, a lot more toxicity. From a player perspective, it adds nothing positive to the gameplay experience. And ultimately, that should be the test in determining whether a feature is worth keeping or not. And finally, the +12 affix should just become an enemy health buff. One-shotting players is not an appropriate reward for timing the previous key you did that was 1 or 2 levels below what you happen to have now. The second measure would be to remove the rewards back to the Dragonflight Season 3 or Season 4 levels. That is, with Misttrack gear dropping from 8s and aspects, Gilded's crests, of course, moving down to 6. An influx of additional player power does much to smooth out the remaining jumps for players who are in that mainstream level. This reward structure was proven to work well in Dragonflight, and there's no reason to think that it would not work just as well today. Yes, this will perpetuate the gear gap between raiding and Mythic Plus. But in my experience, players choose to raid for the experience of it, with gear very much being secondary. And while that idea of gear being secondary is also very true for the high end of Mythic Plus, the mainstream Mythic Plus player base is far more reward driven, and there are many players in Heroic whose ability to get curve is also reliant on the gear they get from Mythic Plus. The gear disparity does, however, still need addressing, but that needs to be done on the raiding side. Perhaps what we need is some more flex-based cosmetic rewards for Mythic Raiders, like cool cosmetics and titles that can display not only the fact you have cutting edge, but even your progress through the raid. The current difficulty of Mythic raiding makes being a Mythic Raider a very big deal. Why not let those players who are able to do it celebrate that fact? And if that proves to be popular, then maybe we could start allowing myth track gear to drop for the last 2 or 3 heroic bosses. Those traditionally have been much harder than the rest of heroic. And if we return to the Battle for Azeroth early Shadowlands gap between heroic mythic raiding, they pretty much start to overlap with the early mythic raid bosses. For the War Within, when it comes to the state of Mythic Plus, the stakes cannot be higher. Mythic Plus has almost certainly overtaken Raid as the most important part of the game, at least for competitive players, and allowing it to be anything less than the best possible experience for the mainstream player base can only put the future of the entire game at risk. Now, I do know that there are still plenty of players who prefer raiding over Mythic Plus, but there's so many of the Mythic Plus player base crossing over into raiding. If we lose them from the game, not only is it going to create a recruitment crisis for raiders, it will very likely make it very difficult for Blizzard to justify the continued development costs for raids to their masters at Microsoft. And back at the start of this year, Blizzard did get to find out what Microsoft's response to not meeting their business goals is going to be. I don't really think I need to say any more on that subject, do you? Anyways, that's my thoughts for the current state of Mythic Plus and how Blizzard can perhaps bring it back closer in line with player expectations. But what about all of you? What's your experience of the Mythic Plus season so far? Have you been enjoying the extra challenge, or have you already quit for now? Let me know in the comments down below. If you found this video interesting or informative, then please let both me and the YouTube algorithm know by hitting that like icon. And if you want to support my channel or just see more from me, make sure to subscribe. There's going to be loads more content from me coming real soon. That's all for now. Thanks for watching.